Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our today's Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies public lecture. My name is Anna Stershis, and I am the director of Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to read the University of Toronto's land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge that this land on which the University of Toronto operates, for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We're also grateful and excited to welcome Dr. Michail Kitsos to our lecture today. Dr. Kitsos holds a position of Igor Kaplan Postdoctoral Fellow in Christian-Jewish Relations at the Center and at the Toronto School of Theology. This joint postdoctoral fellowship has been established to promote scholarship that contributes to the understanding of Jewish and Christian faiths and cultures and their interrelationship. And I would like to sincerely thank Kaplan family for supporting the creation of this important fellowship. And I have to say, we cannot be happier to have the holder of this position, Dr. Kitsos, has come to Toronto at a difficult time when we don't leave our houses, and interhuman, let alone Jewish-Christian relationship, are difficult to think about and maintain. And I've been very happy that Dr. Kitsos is here working on his scholarship, and we're going to learn more about this today. So the lecture that Dr. Kitsos will be presenting is called In Other Worlds, Impersonation and Legitimation in Jewish and Christian Texts from Late Antique and Middle Byzantine periods. Dr. Kitsos holds PhD from University of Michigan, specializing in the history of Judaism and Christianity in late antiquity. Dr. Kitsos uses Christian and Jewish sources to examine Jewish and Christian identity formation and construction, production of otherness and difference, as well as intertwined histories of Jews and Christians in the late antiquity and the Middle Byzantine period and the Mediterranean world, as I said earlier. The emphasis is on the ongoing crossing of religious and social boundaries. Really timely, right? They are currently working on the book project, which is a study of Jewish and Christian use of impersonation in late antiquity. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and please help me welcome Dr. Kitsos. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Stershis, for organizing this series of public lectures and for giving me the opportunity to be part of this community of scholars. Also, before I get started, I would like to thank Professor Michael Rosenthal, who has also been instrumental in putting together this series of public lectures. And I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Judith Newman, my faculty mentor at the University of Toronto, Professor Emerita Ann Anderson at the Toronto School of Theology, and Mrs. Galina Weisman, Ms. Natasha Rikiki-Fried, and Mrs. Kostas Chan for their work behind the scenes to give flesh and bones to this series. My talk today is based on my book I'm currently working on. Of course, given the constraints of time, I cannot present my book project as thoroughly as I would have liked to. So for this reason, I will limit myself to discussing only one chapter as a showcase of the broader argument I am making in my book. I hope it will be an informative glimpse of my work, and it will instigate a nice conversation at the end. So any feedback and comments will be more than welcome. In my book, I examine the rhetorical device of impersonation, or speaking as the other, in Jewish and Christian sources from late antiquity and the Middle Byzantine period, a time period that extends roughly from 200 of the Common Era to 1200 of the Common Era in the Mediterranean world. I investigate impersonation as one of the most concealed ways of constructing otherness and identity. In Christian anti-Jewish and non-anti-Jewish works, Christian authors present stories in which Jews are involved. Such anti-Jewish works may include long dialogues between Christians and Jews, such as the infamous, as I like to call them, adversus or contra-Judeos dialogues, which are dialogues against the Jews, or they may involve treatises against Jews in which their Christian authors wrote long tirades against them. On the other hand, non-anti-Jewish works may include, for example, hagiographies, in which a Christian author may happen to include an excerpt that describes an incident where a Jew is involved, and the description of that incident may involve a particular behavior or course of action instigated by a Jew or Jews. What these works share is the fact that their Christian authors are impersonating a Jew, speaking as a Jew, and imagining how a Jew would act under certain circumstances. Turning to classical rabbinic literature and in post-rabbinic literature, we see a similar rhetorical technique. The two Talmudim, Yerushalmi and Bavli, or the Palestinian and Babylonian Midrashim, are replete with brief discussions between rabbis and other characters, rabbinic, non-rabbinic, and non-Jewish, such as the Minim, whom I am particularly focusing on in my book. In these dialectical rabbinic excerpts, we don't merely see rabbis engaging in conversation with other interlocutors, either from their group or from outside their group. A closer look at these conversations can show us that the anonymous rabbinic authors and editors who put together these stories impersonate the other characters that the rabbis are presented to talk with. In my book, I argue that Christian and Jewish authors applied impersonation by either speaking as the other character against whom they write in certain works, or by imagining how the other character would act in certain circumstances and portray them acting in such a way in order to create narratives of legitimacy. I further explain that Christian and Jewish authors were concerned with proving the legitimacy or authority of their religious system, with each community having different motivations for doing so. Thus, impersonating the Jewish and Christian other was a powerful device to which both Christian and Jewish authors had recourse, and through which they both constructed powerful and enduring images about the impersonated other that allowed them to argue for and justify the legitimacy of their respective religious community, moving beyond previous concepts of supersessionism for Christians and chosenness for the Jews. But before I discuss my chapter in more detail, I will explain the concepts I have already referred to, supersessionism and chosenness. I understand that many of you are familiar with them, but I think giving some succinct background information about them will illuminate my argument further. So let me share my screen. I will start with talking about supersessionism. Christians, from early on in their religious history, began to see their relationship with Jews on the basis of supersessionism. That is a theological idea that the belief in Jesus and in the good news he brought replaced the Mosaic law and the need to keep the Torah. For Christians, the new covenant, which was now between God and the new Israel, replaced the old covenant between God and Israel, who were the chosen people of God. As I saw in the following text on slide 3, already in the first half of the 2nd century, Justin the Martyr, in his dialogue against Trypho the Jew, insinuates the theological idea of supersessionism when he writes, "We have been led to God through this crucified Christ, and we are the true spiritual Israel and the descendants of Judah, Jacob, Isaac and Abraham, who, though uncircumcised, was approved and blessed by God because of his faith and was called the father of many nations." Justin speaks in the first person plural and plays with the idea that Christians are the true Israel due to their belief in God through the crucifixion of Jesus. As you can see, he creates a genealogical connection between Christians and the forefathers of Israel in reverse, culminating with Abraham. In so doing, Justin underlines a particular absence upon which he capitalizes: the lack of circumcision. Lacking circumcision was not a prerequisite for Abraham to believe in God, insinuating a parallelism with Christians on both grounds. At the same time, he builds the genealogical association of Christians with Abraham by designating Abraham as the father of many nations. As I said earlier, Justin here does not refer explicitly to the idea of Christians replacing Israel, but breaking forth the notion of the new Israel, he insinuates the existence of an old Israel. Half a century later, Tertullian discusses more explicitly the idea of supersessionism, and you can see this in the text on slide 4. Tertullian makes a direct juxtaposition between the old and the new law. Therefore, who is understood other than us, who, having been instructed in the new law, observe it, since the old law has been cancelled, whose future abolition he was demonstrating beforehand by that very act? For the old law used to protect itself by the vigilance of the sword, and used to tear out eye for eye, and would pay back injury with revenge. However, the new law was pointing out clemency, and was changing the previous savagery of sword and lance into stillness, and was reforming the previous conduct of war against rivals and enemies into the peaceful actions of plowing and cultivating the land. Therefore, as we have shown above, just as the season of the old law and circumcision of the flesh was declared, so too the observance of the new law and of circumcision of the spirit has shown forth in peaceful obedience. The new law replaces the old after the latter's abolition. The stark contrast between the old and the new law is given by understanding the former in the context of promoting and supporting the lex talionis or lawful retaliation, and by perceiving the latter in the context of a hypothetical leniency. In Tertullian's religious thought, the diabolic cessation and observance that relates to both circumcision and law encapsulates the beginnings of establishing supersessionism as the basis of the distinction between believers of Jesus and those Jews who remained loyal to the observance of the Torah. The theological concept of supersessionism continued to be used and propagated in the subsequent centuries, finding its place in a plethora of different Christian literary genres. In the 4th century, John Chrysostom deploys it extensively in his homilies, in particular in his 8 homilies against the Judaizers. This is slide 5. John elaborates the concept further. In one of several instances, he writes, "Many of the prescriptions of the law were devoted to the ministries of the priesthood, and the old priesthood has been abolished. Since another priesthood was brought in to replace the old, it is clear also that a greater law had to be brought in to replace the old." Chrysostom makes an a fortiori argument involving the institution of priesthood applying the replacement theology not merely on the Jewish law as a collective entity, but also on those aspects that Jewish law defines. In the aforementioned text, the Jewish priesthood is replaced by the Christian priesthood. In other places, in his 8 homilies, the Jewish rituals are replaced by Christian rituals. In these instances, the analogy is the same. If a practice or institution stipulated by Jewish law is replaced by a practice or institution stipulated by Christian law, the abolishing power of the new law is such that it suffices to replace the old. In other words, Chrysostom becomes explicit in regard to the replacement theology, applying it specifically to any aspect of the religious life of his contemporary Jews. Such an application of supersessionism suggests a replacement of Judaism by Christianity, albeit this proposition does not appear in Christian literature, but its overtones are apparent. The application of the theological concept of supersessionism continued unabatedly, and we find it even in works from the 10th century and beyond, such as in the dialogue of Creientos with the Jew Herban. The dialectical excerpt on slide 6 writes, "Herban said, Abraham died as a Hebrew, and you testify yourself that he is holy, and similarly the prophets and the others. Therefore, if I am a Hebrew as well, for which reason do you say that you will not receive salvation by the law?" The Archbishop said, "Before the law began, and when it had begun, before it ended, many pleased the Lord well through it, and I do not deny that. But when Christ came, the law was silent and has no effect anymore. Therefore, in the beginning your administrator Moses disposed according to your law to you who were in the field of the law. But when Jesus Christ came and gave other much better orders, the administrator was silent, and you, his servants, who were also his hired laborers, mattered. As you see in this dialectical excerpt, the capacitation of the Mosaic law was the result of a new law that was given by Jesus. And we see this already happening in the 10th century, this theology. Although the language is not one that suggests the cancellation of the Mosaic law, nevertheless, it portrays it as becoming silent and ineffective on its own accord. It reminds more of a competition where the losing party retreats willingly before the winning party. What I'm trying to say here is that in the later centuries, the expression of supersessionism is transformed in a way that suggests the replacement of Judaism by Christianity almost as a willful action on part of Judaism. Whereas Christians had to grapple with the replacement theology, and I will explain later on why I use particularly the phrasal verb to grapple with, ancient Jews, on their part, were dealing with the and their concept of chosenness. Already in the Hebrew Bible, two particular textual references corroborate this idea. The first is in the book of Genesis, chapter 17, verses 2 and 9. The text is on slide 8. Here we read, "And I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will make you exceedingly numerous. And God said, But Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. And I will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring to come." God announces to Abraham the making of a covenant with him and his descendants, whose visible sign will be circumcision. Exactly the sign of circumcision we saw in the Christian texts. In the same chapter, God announces to Abraham that Sarah will give birth to a son. The continuation of the covenant with Abraham's descendants will be through Isaac and not through Ishmael, showing already the divine choice as to the contracting parties. The second textual reference is in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 14, verse 2. This is slide 9. The biblical verse reads, "For you are a people consecrated to the Lord your God, chose you from among all other peoples on earth to be his treasured people." The distinctiveness of Israel in relation to the other nations is underlined by the special relationship it collectively has with God, being God's holy nation in the present time. The idea of Israel's chosenness in comparison to other nations is buttressed by the use of the Hebrew verb bahar, which means to choose, to select, and of the Hebrew feminine noun segulah, which means treasure, possession, suggesting a personal relationship with God in which God holds the exclusivity of Israel as a special type of property. As opposed to an earlier reference to the designation of Israel as a holy nation which is transmitted to the future and which comprises part of the special relationship with God as we see in Exodus 19:5-6, in Deuteronomy this designation happens in the present, with Israel having already entered into the status of chosenness in relation to the other nations. This biblical idea of Israel's chosenness continues in rabbinic literature, and here I will use only a couple of examples, since the rabbinic discussions on the topic are numerous. Some of these discussions fluctuate between Israel's compulsion to accept the Torah and Israel's own choice to worship the one God. Let us look at slide 10. Bavli Shabbat 88a reads, "And they stood at the lowermost part of the mount. Rav Avdimi bar Chama bar Chassa said, the verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a tank, and God said to them," that is the Jews, "if you accept the Torah, it is good, and if not, there will be your burial." According to the Babylonian Amora Rav Avdimi bar Chama bar Chassa, God forced Israel to accept the Torah by suspending Mount Sinai over them and threatening to kill them on the opposite case. And in Bavli Avodah Zarah 2b3a, there is a long discussion between God and the nations on the acceptance of the Torah by Israel and not by them, with Resh Lakish to tell the story that had Israel not accepted the Torah, God would have returned the world to the primordial chaos. The early discussion in Bavli Avodah Zarah 2b3a between God and the nations that they would have also accepted the Torah had they also been forced, as Israel did, ends up to a castigation against them on the grounds that although they had accepted the Noahide laws, they never observed them. The dilemma that seems to be raised here is to what extent Israel had the free will to become the chosen people of God, given the fact that the Hebrew Bible, the chosenness of Israel, seems arbitrary. Among the rabbinic understandings of Israel's chosenness and Israel's agency in the process, the story of Israel's willing choice to accept the Torah is the most well known. The 3rd century Midrash on Exodus, Mechilta Rabbi Yishmael, the text is on slide 11, narrates the giving of the Torah as part of a process during which God first addressed God's self to the other nations, which rejected its observance after finding out what it would entail to keep it, namely contradicting their ways of living, and then God concluded to Israel, who accepted the Torah without hesitation. According to the rabbinic excerpt, but when he came to the Israelites, and at his right hand was a fiery law unto them, they all opened their mouths and said, all that the Lord has spoken will do and obey. Already this story distinguishes Israel in relation to the nations, but now the agency is in Israel's hands, with the idea of chosenness to pertain to Israel's choice to take upon itself the task to keep God's law. This story also appears in Numbers Rabbah from the 12th century, showing a dissemination of the idea of Israel's chosenness beyond late antiquity. Of course, rabbis had to deal also with the question on whether Israel's chosenness can be reversed, and the discussion between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir in Sifrei Deuteronomy is indicative of this. This is slide 12. The interpretation of Deuteronomy 14:2 brings forth two contradictory opinions. Children are you to the Lord your God, Rabbi Yehuda says. When you conduct yourselves as children, you are children. When you do not conduct yourselves as children, you are not children, Rabbi Meir says. In either instance, you are called children, as it is written, they are foolish children, and children without faith, a seed of evildoers, perverse children. And instead of being said of them, you are not my people, it will be said of them, children of the living God. Here we do not have a resolution, but Rabbi Meir's opinion, which he supports with 4 biblical references, suggests the dominance of his view and the irrevocability of the status of Israel as the chosen people of God, irrespective of their transgressions, as the biblical verses suggest. These cases that I just discussed may show that the rabbis were concerned with the biblical concept of the random or deliberate election of Israel as the chosen people of God and Israel's role in that election. Of course, I omitted rabbinic discussions on the reasons why God chose Israel in particular to give the Torah to, or to designate Israel as the chosen people, as we can see in Pirkei Avot or in Leviticus Rabbah. Both argue that the choice of Israel was out of unrequited love, or in Leviticus Rabbah, in Midrash Tanhuma Masechet Ekev, where Israel was chosen due to Israel's merits. Nevertheless, all these discussions indicate a continuous rabbinic interest to address the special relationship between Israel and God and Israel's particular status in relation to the other nations. This is particularly the case with the emergence of Christianity, whose rise seems to have sparked the need for self-definition on its own right, and vis-à-vis ancient Judaism, and which activated Judaism's reflections of self-definition in relation to Christianity as well. By this I mean that the fact that Christians and Jews, each on their part, dealt in a continuum with questions of supersessionism and chosenness, respectively, can show both communities' need for narratives that would strengthen their theological position with regard to each other. And this is where the concept of legitimacy comes in. Earlier I said that Christians grappled with the theological concept of supersessionism, that is the idea that Christians are the new Israel and the new people of God. I also said that Christians grappled with this concept across the different time periods of their literary production, extending even beyond the period I'm examining in my book. Similarly, ancient Jews were dealing with the concept of Israel's chosenness But since this chapter I'm presenting today focused on Christians' part, I will concentrate only on the Christians. Although the idea that Christians are the new chosen people of God was deployed to justify Christianity as a new religious system, Supersessionism was never a convincing theological concept. Not just for ancient Jews, which makes a lot of sense, but for Christians as well. The need to keep arguing that Christianity replaced Judaism and to keep engaging in parallelisms according to which Christianity is Isaac and Judaism is Edom, or that the church is Sarah and the synagogue is Hagar, suggests that Christians were in constant need of reconfirming their relationship with Judaism. In other words, they were not convinced by their own concept of being the new Israel before Jews who had the affirmation of their status as the chosen people of God already the Septuagint or the Vulgate or the Peshitta, which Christians were reading, or actually they were hearing in the church, and which the church had endorsed in her liturgical life. Christians needed legitimacy that Christianity was indeed the new Israel, and that Christians were indeed the new people of God. The idea of supersessionism merely allowed them to say that they are the above mentioned, but it could not provide them the authoritative confirmation that they were in fact so, especially when in the Old Testament they would read about the adoption of ancient Israelites as God's firstborn and the elevation of Israel as a holy nation and a nation of priests. With Jews confirming for themselves their chosenness, supersessionism was insufficient for the Christians to prove the opposite. Legitimacy, however, would allow ancient and medieval Christians to make claims about their new status by having their audience, eternal and external, accept without question precisely this status, and consequently acknowledge the authority of the church as the new Israel. Part of my argument is also to explain that the failing of the idea of supersessionism may also justify the anti-Jewish policies and actions throughout late antiquity and the Middle Ages. In other words, Christians were striving on two frontiers. They had to argue that only their religion had the rightful authority to claim to be the new Israel, and they had to convince the Jews to admit so as well. Whereas Christians believed in the validity of their system, at the same time they would find challenging the fact that not everyone believed so, something that could invalidate their trust in their effectiveness of supersessionism. One of the tools which Christians deployed to argue for the legitimacy of their religious system was ethopoieia or impersonation, that is, an imitation of the character of a person supposed to be speaking. Ethopoieia is one of the rhetorical exercises in progymnasmata, handbooks of compositional exercises for rhetorical purposes commonly used in late antiquity and continued to be used and composed in Byzantine education until the last Paleology period in the 15th century, such as the rhetorical exercises of Nikiforos Vasilakis, a theologian and writer who lived in the 12th century and was credited for introducing new teaching techniques. Paleology period is the dynasty of the Paleologos, who during that dynasty we have the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. Christian authors impersonated the Jew as a character, imagining what a Jew would say in a discussion with a Christian, or how a Jew would act in certain situations. In other words, Christians engaged in a process of othering by impersonating the other person, in particular the Jews, against whom they wrote in their works. Applying impersonation, Christian authors created either images of the Jews or created two distinct categories of the Jew of the past and the Jew of the present. I will now talk about these two characterizations. The two images of the Jew of the past and the Jew of the present appear almost ubiquitously in the adversus Judaeos dialogues, which are imaginary discussions between Christians and Jews. Let us look at the text on slide 14. This excerpt is from a 10th century dialogue between Archbishop Gregentius and a Jew named Herban, and it presumably takes place in the 5th century, Himyar, modern-day Yemen. The text writes, Herban said, "It has been written that he who makes his angel spirits and his ministers a flaming fire. How can you Christians worship the holy angels by depicting the worthy nature of the holy angels? Perhaps you can worship those who have possessed bodies, because, as you say, by depicting through them the form of their bodies, we honor them, and we do not divinize them by worshipping their shadow. Well then, for what reason do you worship the angels who have acquired neither bodies, nor did anyone see clearly their incorporeal shape as it is? For they are imperceivable spirits, and they are utterly without reflection, and they are immaterial." Herban's question to Gregentius is a plausible one. He makes a rational argument, but he is careful enough to still demonstrate his rejection of any practice that involves the worship of other beings in addition to God. To substantiate his argument, Herban makes a premise and states that he could comprehend the veneration of saints on the grounds that they have material bodies and thus they are visible. Venerating bodiless celestial powers, however, exceeds rationality for Herban. In other words, Herban criticizes all the more so the representation of angels and thus their veneration. For my work, the interesting aspect of this excerpt is not a Jewish criticism against the pictorial representation and veneration of bodiless beings, but that the Christian author impersonates the Jew and speaks through the Jew as if he, the author, is a Jew himself. The Jew does not negate the reality of the angels or the belief in them. As L. M. Neuberger has argued, the term real, with regard to angels in late antiquity, meant that they were, quote, culturally operational, end quote, which means that, quote, Christians expected the angels to exist and to persist, and that they accepted that angels could interact with human beings, end quote. So Herban believed in the angels. The Jew is presented to negate the depiction and veneration of angels. Speaking as the Jew, the author portrays him to oppose a Christian practice and to be correct to do so. Herban is the Jew of the present, but this is not the image we will focus for now. Gregentius' answer is telling of the picture of the Jew the author is trying to build, as you can see from Gregentius' reply on slide 15. The Archbishop said, "Even here you will not have something to say, for we found from you to depict the angels of God. Verily, when Solomon built the temple of God the highest, in the Holy of Holies above the mercy seat he composed, with mosaic, cherubim of glory, overshadowing the altar. And he constructed cherubim at the first gate of the sanctuary and at the second gate of the temple. Therefore, you all see how by depicting them you worshipped the incorporeal natures, and you all censure us over against how much we honor and worship the saints because they please the Lord well in their body by depicting them." Gregentius attributes the making of pictorial depictions of celestial powers to ancient Israelites. In particular, he associates two and three-dimensional representations of angels with the temple cult, receiving, as one may correctly assume, information about them from the Old Testament. At the same time, Gregentius claims that the portrayal of angels alone equated with their worship and thus it justified it. However, what makes Gregentius' reply particularly interesting is how he addresses his Jewish interlocutor in the second person plural. In so doing, he has three objectives, two explicit and one implicit. His first explicit objective is that he addresses the Jews collectively as a community. Gregentius responds to Herban, but in reality he responds to the Jewish people through Herban. Thus, the individual address is transformed to a collective address. The second explicit objective pertains to the Archbishop associating the contemporary Jews with the ancient Jews, in particular the biblical Israelites. A brief parenthesis. This particular point is compelling on its own right because this affiliation enforces the genealogical connection between ancient and contemporary Jews and enhances the Jewish argument that contemporary Jews continue their special status as the chosen people of God, as I'll discuss in chapters of my book where I examine Jewish impersonation of Christians. close parenthesis. By connecting contemporary Jews with biblical Israelites, Graiendius moves to his third, implicit this time, objective. He insinuates that the Christians' veneration of angels and saints continued a biblical Israelite practice which contemporary Jews criticized, although Jews' own ancestors engaged with it first. Additionally, he further implies that Christians are associated more with biblical Israelites than their contemporary Jews. In another work from the end of the 7th century of the Common Era, the Trophies of Damascus, the Christian author also plays with the idea of the parallel biblical Israelite and Christian cultic activities. As you read in the text on slide 16, the Christian said, "What, really? Do you not worship hand-made created things?" The Jew said, "Mercy, mercy. May the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob not allow." The Christian said, "Then, if I prove that apart from God you worship other things, what shall we do? If I say what these other things are, you become Christians. Otherwise, if I lie, I become a Jew. You can say that it is not allowed. Therefore, if I show you that you worship both images and woods and stones, first you will no longer talk about the cross, and then you will confess that you lie for all that you said." The Christian interlocutor connects his contemporary Jews with biblical Israelites. The contention deals with whether biblical Israelites, per the Christian author's reading, engaged in a cultic activity that his contemporary Jewish discussant would consider idolatrous. At stake is whether Christianity is correct or incorrect with regard to its cultic expressions for the worship of God. The author's answer through his Christian character, as we see on slide 17, is indicative of the technique Christian authors have used when it comes to understand their relationship with Jews and Judaism. Here we read, "And with regard to the icons that are with us, just as you placed in your ark of the covenant the staff of Aaron and the jar of manna as a reminder of God's benefactions, so also we do those icons as a reminder of those things that Christ performed to us, or his saints whose representations when we see, we imitate the works. And just as in order to honor God, you venerate the book of his words, so also when we glorify Christ, we revere his cross as a reminder of him alone." The Christian parallelizes Christians' remembrance of the divine through icons with a similar objective, exercised by biblical Israelites through certain sacred objects in the tabernacle. The parallelism becomes starker when the Christian finds a similar correspondence between the veneration of the Torah scrolls as a means to worship God and the veneration of the cross as a means to extol Christ. The author of the Trophies of Damascus shows Christians and biblical Israelites in a continuum on matters of practice. However, while this continuum is built upon positive terms, the continuum between the biblical Israelites and contemporary Jews is built upon negative ones. Contemporary Jews opposed to the practices of their own ancestors. The second image Christian authors create by speaking as a Jew is that of the Jew of the present. Today I will discuss two examples from a Latin dialogue written between the 3rd and the early 5th century of the Common Era, the altercation of Simon and Theophilus. In a discussion between Simon the Jew and the Christian Theophilus on Jesus' divinity, Simon requests further proofs about the matter. According to the text 18a on slide 18, Simon is portrayed to say, "But that thing I want you to explain to me. If in any place God made Christ a God by his own self, only then will I consider thoroughly to believe Christ as God and the Son of God." One may see here a genuine interest on part of Simon in believing in Jesus' sonship and his divinity as God. That would probably be the case though, namely, that Simon genuinely desires to know about the relationship of the Son with the Father and his status as a God, if Simon's question wouldn't be on the Arian thesis that the Son was made God. Simon here corresponds to the character of the contemporary Jew, or the Jew of the present, who uses a contemporary Christian issue as the anchor to instigate a discussion on Jesus' divinity and the hypostatic relationship with the other two persons in the Trinity. The impersonation of the Jew starts already with quoting a non-Nicene Christian belief, and it makes us wonder why the Christian author would choose to present the Jew to ask this particular question. Text 18b on the same slide may illuminate more about the reasons. The Christian character responds to Simon's query in a way that shows his intentions. O non-believing Jew, now are you disputing the prophets? However, receive this answer to your question. God is being addressed to Moses when he says, "Behold, I have assigned you a God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will be your prophet." Understand that Moses was a type of Christ, a God for the non-believing Gentiles. How much more is Christ a God for those who believe? For just as Moses freed the people from Egypt from the roughest slavery of Pharaoh, so also Christ freed his people from the slavery of idols and from the dominion of the devil. Theophilus discerns the nature of Simon's aforethought inquiry and retorts with an admonition. Quoting Exodus 7:1, Theophilus explains the difference between someone being assigned a God, in the sense of a leader, as in the case of Moses, and one being a real God, as in the case of Jesus, whom Moses foreshadows according to the Christian author. Theophilus further demands from Simon to see the relationship between Moses and Jesus, and to distinguish between Moses, whose performance of miracles presented him as God to the Egyptians, and Jesus, whose defeat of idolatry and Satan proved his divinity per the author. The author engages in a succinct theological explanation of Jesus' status and role conforming with Nicene Christianity. However, this is not so much the point in terms of the author speaking as a Jew. The Christian author wants to emphasize particular qualities of his contemporary Jewish interlocutor. One more example further shows the systematic effort of the Christian author to construct the image of his contemporary Jew in a way that strengthens the Christian understanding of Scripture. The discussion concerns, again, the divinity of Jesus, a favorite topic of the Christian authors of most adverse Judaeus dialogues. As we read in the text on slide 19, most sacred is Christ's voice, which, if you wish to understand, it is necessary to believe first, and only then will you be able to comprehend. For Isaiah refutes you when he says, "Unless you will believe, you will not comprehend." Therefore, without doubt we know, and we perceive, and we worship the omnipotent, invisible, without end, and incomprehensible God, and in turn we acknowledge that Christ is God and the Son of God. That which he says, "I am the first and I am the last," signifies the two comings of Christ. This excerpt is part of a longer conversation in which Simon refutes the Nicene Christian belief in the divinity of Jesus and instead supports the monarchy of God. To rebut Simon's argument, Theophilus deploys Isaiah 7:9 and emphasizes the theological relationship between belief and comprehension in regard to Jesus' divinity, something that for Theophilus only Christians have achieved. In other words, to understand entails to believe. Let us examine, though, how the Christian author of the dialogue text attempts to construct the image of Theophilus' Jewish interlocutor. It is not Theophilus that disproves Simon, but it is Isaiah himself who does so. Being disproved by the biblical prophet, Simon's validity as an interpreter of the scripture is negated in favor of Theophilus' cogency to do so. The orderly use of verbs of perception, novimus et scimus, we know and we perceive, accompanied by a verb colimus, a verb of cultic and religious semantics, colimus, we worship, comes to support the Christian meaning of Isaiah 7:9. Unless you will believe, you will not comprehend. Christians comprehend because they believe. And as if Isaiah addresses himself to the contemporary Jew, Simon, he says to him, if you don't believe, you will not comprehend. This image of the Jew of the present, being refuted by their own biblical prophets, creates a powerful dynamic between Christians and Jews, posing the question, who can accurately understand Scripture better between Jews and Christians? And now let's turn to what all of this means. How do Supersessionism, Impersonation, and the Jew of the past and the Jew of the present come together? The need for a narrative that would allow Christians to argue for the new status they decided to acquire in the context of religious competition in the ancient Mediterranean world inspired them to invent the idea of replacing Judaism and of being the new Israel. The effectiveness of this theological justification for the existence and dissemination of Christianity was challenged already by the presence of the biblical concept of Israel's chosenness, which appears throughout the Hebrew Bible and its traditions to which Christians had access. Of course, whereas Christian authors' extensive and recurrent analysis of Christians' new status and special relationship with God comprise a direct opposition to the biblical idea of Israel's special status, however, have recourse to other methods that were less direct but more insidious, seems to have been a direction Christian authors took in order to strengthen the Christian's new status. Impersonation, or speaking as the other, in particular speaking as a Jew, allowed Christian authors to engage in an underhanded fashion in a process of othering that did not necessitate Christians to state that they took over the position that Jews once had, but instead authorized them to construct this narrative by presenting the Jew speaking or acting in a way that would undermine methodically and gradually the biblical concept of Israel's chosenness. Scholars such as Marcel Simon, Miriam Taylor, Daniel Boyarin, Annette Joshi-Corid, and Michal Barasel-Sigal have shed light onto the images of Jews and Christians in Christian literature from late antiquity, or the antagonism between the two, their contacts, influences, and of course the parting or not parting of their ways. But the question that still remains is the following. What is happening when Christians and Jews speak as Jews and Christians respectively? How is it possible that a Christian becomes the Jew against whom he writes, and the Jew becomes the other, the Christian, against whom he also writes? Why was impersonation or ethopoieia so important that both Christians and Jews applied it in their literatures across the centuries, when one could say that the parting of the ways had already happened, sometime between the 2nd to the 5th or the 6th century of the Common Era, or hadn't happened, in the sense that we can still spot literary or cultural contacts between the two communities, since they lived in the same discursive environment, and at least they had already created theologies that kept them pretty distinctive. What was really at stake, if we take into consideration that Christianity had triumphed and it was elevated to the status of the state religion in the East and the West? And since in my talk today I discussed about the Christians, why would Christians feel the need to keep impersonating the Jew in their works across centuries? In a lecture Ellen Murberger gave in 2021, she talked about the rhetorical exercise of speech in character, ethopoieia, making inter alia a very compelling observation and argument. Speech in character, which young men were also taught in the rhetorical classroom, reveals even more starkly the agency of power they were being trained to exercise later on, and contributed to, quote, a powerful reinforcement of the status quo, end quote, for through this rhetorical exercise, they believe they know effectively the character they impersonated. To take that one step further in the context of my research, by impersonating the Jew, Christian authors were assuming the authority and the legitimation they were lacking for centuries vis-à-vis the Jews. They were aiming to take control of the biblical concept of chosenness by constructing images of the Jews that would be incompatible with their status as God's chosen people. The Jew of the past and the Jew of the present are two categories that are fabricated from othering the Jew through impersonation. The Jew of the past is the biblical Israelites, whose biblical practices, established and delineated by God and then continued by Christians, the Jew of the present negates. The Jew of the present is connected genealogically to the Jew of the past, but this is in the former's disadvantage towards Christians because he rejects his own biblical ancestors' modus operandi in a cultic context. For the Christian authors, when it comes to matters of practice, the Christians simply carried on what the Jews of the present's biblical ancestors did, while the Jew of the present is found breaking from his own ancestors. As to the Jew of the present, this is the contemporary imaginary Jew with whom Christian authors discuss in their works. The erroneousness of the Jew of the present already manifests by how the Christian author speaking as a Jew asks to know about Jesus from a non-Nicene Christian perspective. In other words, the Jew asks the wrong question, or to be more accurate, the Christian author speaking as a Jew presents him to ask the wrong question. So the Jew of the present is at fault not only because he negates Christian beliefs, but also because he wants to know about them from a non-normative Christian angle. Such representation of the Jew already highlights his negative qualities. All the more so, in matters of Christian belief, it is biblical Israelites of authority that talk against the Jew of the present, with the Christian authors assuming their own authority of matters of belief by authority figures of ancient Israel. To understand the power of personation, let us briefly see the protocols of the elders of Zion. This is the anti-Semitic text par excellence that first appeared in 1903 Russia and supposedly comprises minutes from an alleged meeting between Jewish leaders who devised a secret plan for Jews to rule the world. The author speaks as an inside informant and uses first-person singular and first-person plural to discuss their goals towards the Goyim, Gentiles. The anonymous author speaks as a Jew, and as a Jew, he creates the image of the Jew who conspires, machinates, and plots to finally control the world. This is not what really happened, but speaking as a Jew, this anonymous non-Jewish author who constructs the image of the Jew as a collective community who has designs against Christians, wants to persuade that it did happen. Impersonation allowed Christians to construct and change characters at will, exercising their power of authority upon ancient Jews in order to argue for the legitimacy of their Christianity. By impersonating the Jew, Christians engaged in another way of othering that would determine and undermine their audience's perception of the Jews, allegedly from within the Jews themselves. Thank you.